The Off the Charts Football Podcast is brought to you by MyBookie.ag. MyBookie.ag is the most convenient website to wager on sporting events from all the major sports. My favorite thing about MyBookie is the mobile optimized site that makes it easy to place bets from the comfort of your smartphone. Whether on the couch, at the bar, or on your lunch break, it's easy to make bets on the fly with MyBookie. Don't miss out on free money. Join now with the promo code OFFTHECHARTS and MyBookie will match your deposit with a 50% bonus. That's promo code OFFTHECHARTS, one word, to activate the offer. Again, visit mybookie.ag today. You play, you win, you get paid. Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined as always by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. Aaron, we were planning on starting today with a requiem for Jimmy Smith, our favorite performance-enhanced corner in the AFC North, but there's bigger news out of that division, and Sashi Brown is gone from the Cleveland Browns.
Yeah, where do I even begin here?
Yes. I mean, so it seems like Hugh Jackson seems to have won this phase of the power struggle. One big question that comes to mind is this a good job? In one sense, there's not job security, obviously, and everything we all think about with the Cleveland Browns. On the other hand, this is a team that resembles a little bit the Philadelphia 76ers when Sam Hinkie left. You got a lot of draft picks, a lot of young talent, and a lot of cap space. Trust the process. And I'm not the only person having this thought. I read Brian Burke tweeted out something, trust the process related. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I shared a lot of my thoughts on Twitter this morning. I've had a little bit of a hissy fit, but hopefully it's understandable to people because this is really important to me. Obviously, the word on the street is that they are getting rid of all of their analytics people, that this is not just Sashi Brown, that they are punting on the entire analytics concept. And they're going to hire John Dorsey as the GM, and Dorsey did a good job in Kansas City. So I can't fault that. But you don't win in the NFL by changing your front office every 2 years. In fact, what Cleveland has done over the last few years, and especially since Jimmy Haslam bought the team in 2012, is frankly, I feel like they've changed their front office even more than that. It's like twice every 3 years or something. There's so much to say about this decision.
Let's start here. Mina Kimes, she said people are going to use Sashi Brown's record as a cudgel against analytics-driven processes when it was actually a failure of execution. And I think that fits exactly into what you're saying there, that people want to say that this was a failure of analytics. This is a failure of letting a process go less than 2 years maximum at a time.
Well, I think we also have to question whether Hugh Jackson was the right head coach for this experiment. I'm a little bit stuck on the idea that Hugh Jackson wanted them to trade top picks to get A.J. McCarron. And there are many people who believe the reason that the A.J. McCarron trade did not happen is that it was essentially deep-sixed by the front office because they knew what nonsense it was. And essentially, Jimmy Haslam here has picked A.J. McCarron over, whatever else, because that's probably Hugh Jackson's guy. Maybe they go out and sign him to a big contract. Maybe they also draft a guy in the first round. I don't know. What I know is that when Haslam hired them, he told them they would have the time. He said he was committed to this. So they didn't have to worry about building a winner in the first couple years. So perhaps one of the reasons why they did not take a first-round quarterback in the first couple years is that they thought they had the time to wait, consistently trade down, and get the first-round quarterback when they felt they had the right guy for the right value. Perhaps if Haslam instead says either you go 6-10 by the second year or you're done, then they draft Wentz or they draft Deshaun Watson. They don't wait. They are going to have their shot at any quarterback they want who's coming out this year. And you can argue that those quarterbacks are not as good as Watson or not as good as Wentz, but we don't know. I don't think that Josh Rosen or Sam Darnold is anywhere, less of a prospect than what Watson was or what Wentz was based on what we knew at the time. Certainly Wentz. I mean, what we knew at the time was this was a guy from 1AA. I think we can talk about lessons we've learned from this about analytics in the NFL. The first is never, ever, ever take a job with Jimmy Haslam. But the second is that I think you have to say that analytics get 2 years. We can't do a process in the NFL There isn't going to be the patience in the NFL that you have in other sports because teams generally can turn themselves from bad to mediocre much faster. And people will get fed up if you don't at least make it to mediocre. Mike Tanier has made the point that a bad losing locker room feeling is probably not a good thing, that's a reason why you can't have a long-term turnaround in the NFL, that you don't get the players' contracts for long enough, right? The guys they drafted in 2016, if they're not competitive until 2018, they only get 2 years out of those guys. I think that makes sense, that from now on, we should think of analytics in the NFL. If you want to do a rebuild like this, if you want to tank, you get 1 year of tanking. By the second year, you want to be 6-10. That being said, this time they committed to doing it in 3 or 4 years. And to fire these guys after 2 means you were lying to them, and it was all a big waste of time.
So I want to take a step back there because I think there's 2 separate things kind of that you're talking about. The first part, you mentioned Jimmy Haslam, and I want to talk about that a little bit because we all saw what went down at the University of Tennessee last week. And I don't know if everybody in our world is aware that Jimmy Haslam is the #1 booster of the Tennessee Volunteers. And I don't have any direct knowledge of anything of the sort, but it wouldn't be crazy to draw a connection there. And the type of dysfunction that we saw last week at the University of Tennessee in their sort of hiring decisions, and think that Jimmy Haslam being the only common thread between that and what we've seen with the Browns for the last 5 years, really, there's reason to believe that there's, like you said, it's not a great job to take. Now, taking that and splitting that out a little bit and saying about how analytics fits into the NFL, I think that's a really interesting question. And I'm really worried that people are going to misinterpret this today. And the reason why I think it's interesting is because there's an agency dilemma when you're a general manager of a football team. And that is that your owner, your fan base, they're stuck to the franchise. They have the long-term, it's going to be a part of what they're doing. You only have a job if you win this year, next year, maybe the following year. If you don't win right now, then you don't get to see years 4 through 10 or beyond and then you have this dilemma where you've got somebody like Bill Belichick and some of the Mike Tomlin and the franchises with stability, that the rich get richer because they don't have to do all of this win now stuff and trying to plug holes. They can be patient and they can trust the process, if you will. So I think that we got to be really careful about how we look at this. And I think that you're absolutely right to say that this was not executed the right way.
Yeah, I mean, you either have to trust the process or not. In the quote that Haslam gave after he announced the firing, he said, "We believe that transitioning to someone with strong experience and success in drafting and building consistently winning football teams is critical to the future of the Cleveland Browns." Okay, then why did you not hire that guy 2 years ago? If what's important to you is strong experience and a track record of success, then why did you hire a man with no football experience who was basically your team lawyer and put him in charge of the team? Either you want to do the analytics thing or not. Like, what were you doing 2 years ago if that's what you wanted? It's the going back and either be old school or be analytics or be a mixture of both. But don't keep dicking around where you've got a new front office every 2 years. It's not going to be successful. So congratulations. You're going to sign A.J. McCarron and Myles Garrett will have 15 sacks next year and you'll go 6-10. And won't that be a freaking parade?
To support what you're saying, I saw a quote from Paul DePodesta from when he was actually taking the job in Cleveland. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what I don't want. If you ever take your kids to an amusement park at Disneyland or whatever, they beg you to go on the Big Daddy roller coaster. They beg you. They say, and then you say, 'Are you sure?' They say, 'Absolutely. I want to go on this thing.' So you wait in line for 45 minutes. It takes up a good chunk of your day. You finally get to the front of the line. They eyeball it and they say, 'I'm not getting on that thing. Not at all.'" And that's what happens to a lot of owners. They say, "Hey, we want Moneyball. We want this disciplined approach that we're doing." But when it comes time to make that hard decision, they say, "I don't want any part of this." Man, does that feel on the nose today?
Oh, it is absolutely what is going on. And look, again, I'm going to say this. We can argue about whether the process in the NFL should have been quicker. We can argue about whether it made sense for them to give it a 3-year plan. But it was clear that's what it was. They would not have traded down out of the first round quarterbacks for 2 straight years if they thought this was a 2-year plan. And so to cut them out before they have a chance to really follow through on it doesn't make any sense. If you want to say in the future that when you hire analytics people, you have to tell them you get 1 year to tank and that's it, then for the future, that's a good idea. I'm with that. I understand that idea. I understand where Mike Tanier, what his arguments are about that. But in this case, they were giving it a 3-year process to fire these guys before they had a chance to follow through on what was supposed to be a 3 or 4 year process. Look, I'm not going to give you specific quotes for specific people, but it's not a secret that I have friends in the front office of the Cleveland Browns. They did not think they had 2 years. That is not what they were told. Okay. I can't give you specific quotes, but I can tell you they did not think they had to win this year to keep their jobs. They thought this was a long-term thing. And to fire them before they have a chance to bring it to fruition, this is not failure by them. Failure is if this team was not competitive by next year or the year after. And I'm hoping that it was a 3-year plan and not a 4, because 4 is way too long. I don't know for sure what the plan was, but it was not 2.
Well, every day that we watch Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons, I'm sure Sam Hinkie feels a combination of kind of the bitterness that you describe right now, but also he feels a little bit vindicated, and I think rightfully so. And maybe we'll see that being the case here. I just want to unpack a little bit more because as somebody that spent 5-6 years of my life within these organizations, including with the Browns themselves, but before that, much longer with the Saints, I don't believe that football is a tank sport. I'm a believer in analytics. I'm a believer in information, and that we can really help ourselves with this stuff. For the record, I'd like to also say that the Patriots have been doing a version of this for much longer than the rest of the NFL, which is a lot of how they've created their advantage over the years. They had a Wall Street guy who used algorithms and formulas to help them educate a lot of the decisions that they've made over the last 20 years. So I think we should take note of that and not just assume that analytics doesn't work. But I really take issue with equating analytics with tanking, especially in this sport, because the point isn't to tank. The point isn't to lose games. The point is to be intelligent about how you allocate your resources, to trade current value for future value. Yes, that's a part of it. But to go into, like you said, one season I think would absolutely be a maximum. We used to call that a rebuilding year. Now all of a sudden we have to call everything tanking in 2017. But that used to be a normal thing in the NFL to have a rebuilding year. But the point is, in that rebuilding year, you want to be building towards winning. You're building an organization. You're building a culture. It's a really hard thing to be involved with this type of a sport and have grown men come through your building every day and know that they don't really have a chance. And I think anybody that tries to go too far in that direction is going to have a really hard time. And also, I think we don't have that incentive in our sport. The number 1 pick is not that much more valuable than the number 15 pick that we need to tank just all out so that we can get into the top 3. This isn't the NBA where the best player on the best team wins. And I think that the dichotomous nature, everybody jumps to one side or the other on this one. And I think there are a lot of us sitting here in the middle that say, man, if we use what these people are doing well and what these people are doing well and combine them and think about this intelligently, and have a little bit more of a worry about the PR effect that clearly Hinkie and Sashi didn't do a great job with. I think this can be something that's a part of building a winning organization.
I agree with you. In this case, however, I don't see what firing them now does to help things for next year. If it was supposed to be a 3-year plan and 3 years is too long, firing them right before the 3rd year still doesn't get you anything.
Right.
But I do think that we have learned a lesson for the future, which is you get 1 year to tank in the NFL, and that is it.
Right. And I agree with that last point.
What we learned from this case is different from what should have happened in this case with Cleveland where they stand now.
And I'll say this, though. Even though it doesn't help to fire them now, I agree with you there. Whoever does get that job is going to be dealt a nice poker hand. They're going to be walking in with pocket aces.
Except
It's not a very good table. A couple holes in the table.
It's a horrible table. That's right. You've got a messed up, coke-addled dealer, okay?
Musical chairs is playing.
Who might just dump the whole table on the ground, no matter how many pocket aces you have, okay? I'm sorry. Haslam, given Tennessee and then Cleveland, oh my God, it's so awful. I can't even start.
Well,
Let's talk about some teams that are good. Let's talk about some teams that are good.
Including teams that use analytics, like the Seahawks and the Ravens. And there are plenty of teams in the NFL that are using these strategies and that are getting better as a result of it. So let's
Philadelphia Eagles, the Patriots. Yes.
So there is a list of teams that's using it and using it well. All right, Aaron, let's move into the football. Let's try to compose ourselves, and let's talk about the Minnesota Vikings and something interesting. They come in at number 6 on DVOA rankings this week, below Baltimore. Their offense is number 6, which feels high. The defense at number 8, which feels low. Does DVOA think the Vikings are overrated? And what does their comparatively low ranking say about their playoff chances?
I think part of the reason why it seems like DVOA might have them too low is just that the teams in the NFC, those top 4 teams, are so good that being the 4th one seems like it's a diss on them. Obviously, they're in the number 1 position right now for playoff seeding because of the way tiebreakers fall. Some of what's going on with Minnesota is that they've had a tendency to give up yards and points late in games, and I know that some people feel like DVOA does a bad job of measuring defense late in games because I found that giving up yardage even in prevent situations does tend to be predictive for the future. And the Vikings are the number 1 defense in the league when they're tied or losing by a touchdown or less. But they're number 13 when they're winning by more than a touchdown, number 8 when they're winning by a single touchdown or less. So they do lighten up a little bit when they have a big lead. But I think that combines with what the team's weakness is, which besides special teams, is the running game. They're number 2 passing. That's amazing, right? They're number 2 passing with Case Keenum at quarterback. Only the Patriots are higher. But they're number 19 running the ball. So when you have a team where the defense is not as good when they're winning, and you have a running game that is mediocre compared to how good the passing game is, you have a team where you have to worry about their ability to hold on to leads. And maybe that hasn't been such a big problem so far, given the easy schedule that they've played. Not an easy schedule. They've actually played a hard schedule, but they've had a lot of these one-score wins. What happens when you get into the playoffs and you've got the Rams again and the Eagles and the Saints? And I mean, I think they're a good team, but I think there is reason to worry, although, I don't think they're that much really below the Rams and Saints and Eagles.
So when I started looking and taking a deeper look, I was surprised at how high the offense was ranked. And then even more, like you said, at the split between the passing and the running. And I started to kind of look into what was going on there. And I think it might have something to do with what you're saying about how they're very good when the game is close or they're slightly behind. And then as their lead grows, they seem to have a less efficient offense, which makes sense to me for a team that's trying to kind of play against the clock as well as just their opponent.
Yeah, I was talking about the defense, but it's true of the offense as well. And you're probably going to give us some stats now, and the DVOA will agree with them.
Interesting. So their offense, I would say, is efficient but not explosive. They actually have the 2nd most rushing attempts in the league. And like you're saying, they're average to below average in terms of their efficiency when running the ball. And I think it's interesting that they're running the ball that much. And specifically, when we split their runs by gap, they have the most inside runs in the league with 208. So that's 55% of their total carries, by far the highest percentage of the league that's either going to in between the A gaps there. So on 90% of those that are going in between the A gaps, they're inside zone runs. So this is simple handoffs going up the middle, inside zone, basic bread and butter play. And they're running that an extremely high percentage of the time when they run the football, and they run the football a lot. So what's the end result of this? They end up being a great play action team. They complete 73% of their passes, 9.8 yards per attempt, six touchdowns, and no interceptions from play action. And it's because they're choosing running plays that might sacrifice some of the upside of having guys pull and having guys run to the outside where there's more space. But what they're doing is helping their pass blocking, and they're helping their passing game as a result. So I don't want to take anything away from Keenum because he's doing an amazing job this year, but it's a great example of how they've put him in position to succeed, and they've really built a complementary team, even without a dominant run game.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting there is that when you then think of simple runs, that then emphasizes the issue of when they're winning late in games, things kind of calm down a bit because their offense in the fourth quarter, they're only 17th in DVOA offensively in the fourth quarter, right? And like I said, when they have a lead, their offense goes down. So if you look at the Minnesota offense, they're number 2 when they're winning by a touchdown or less, and number 7 when they're losing by a touchdown or less. But they're number 15 when they're winning by more than a touchdown. So again, I would worry about the Vikings in the playoffs losing leads. It would be fun. The Vikings and Falcons could just go back and forth all day. The one thing I will say about the play action, though, is all of our research in the past, and it's amazing, we've done this research a lot, shows that the quality of the running game does not matter for how good a team is at play action. And even the frequency of a running game doesn't matter as long as you stay within the bounds of what's like normal, right? Like if you're an extreme, we never run the ball, then the other team never has to worry about the run. But as long as you're within the bounds of what's normal, I mean, linebackers are trained to look for the run. They're going to jump at play fakes for the most part. Whether you're good at running or bad, it doesn't matter if you're bad at running. They still want to stop that running back at the line of scrimmage. So, I mean, I agree with you about Minnesota's complementary offense where all the runs do sort of set up the play action pass. But I think they don't necessarily need to run quite as much as they do to set up that play action. And the fact that those runs up the middle struggle does become a problem when they're trying to run out the clock with leads.
So the one thing that I would say, it's a stat that I think we probably have access to that you might not, is the play action from the zone offenses. When you run a lot of zone offensive plays, we tend to see a greater increase in efficiency on play action than a team that's doing a lot of pulling up front.
That is interesting. That is very
interesting. And that could
have
to do with linebacker keys and these sorts of things.
No, because I tend to think of play action more as pull. Like it's that pulling guard that sends the message of we're running the ball, and then it turns out to be a pass. So if it turns out that that is not actually more efficient than a play action pass that starts out like a zone run, I think that actually is quite interesting.
So I want to say just a careful thing there because I might have misled you a little bit. It's that when you run more zone plays, not the actual puller on the play action play, but when you run a lot more of those zone carries to set up the play action game. So we're not actually looking at whether or not you pull on the play action attempt. Correct.
Interesting. I will say at Minnesota's odds, I mean, the fact that they are a game ahead of New Orleans and the Rams does give them an advantage. And I always talk about the fact that DVOA is not the only thing that guides you to who's going to win in the playoff. There are individual matchups in each game. There are the injuries, and there is the home field advantage. And Minnesota looks very good to get home field advantage. They get a bye week in 76% of our simulations. They're the most likely team to get a number 1 seed in the NFC right now. And therefore, we have Minnesota as number 4 on our list of Super Bowl favorites. So even though they're below the Rams and they're below the Saints in DVOA, and they're even below, believe it or not, the Baltimore Ravens, we have them as the number 4 Super Bowl team because home field matters. Right now, we have the Patriots 4th in weighted DVOA, but we have them number 1 in Super Bowl odds because there's a strong chance of them getting that number 1 seed.
Absolutely, and it helps being in the AFC, of course, this year.
Yes, the NFC is a lot harder. There are really good teams that are going to miss the playoffs, and that brings us to the next guy you wanted to talk about, and that is Mr. Dez Bryant.
Yeah, so Dez Bryant, and people have been asking the question all year long, and even more than just this year, what happened to Dez Bryant? And I wanted to do a little bit of research to look into this and try to get a better understanding of what routes he's running and what he could be doing differently right now. I think we all perceive a little bit that he's lost maybe a half a step in terms of deep speed and that sort. But I don't think it totally explains everything that we're seeing in terms of what's happened to Dez. So he's got 109 targets this year. 73 of those are when lined up outside as opposed to in the slot. So that's the 4th most targets when lined up wide in the league. So that gives you a little bit of an understanding of what Dez Bryant is, who he is. And that's very consistent with what he's been within their offense throughout his career. Unfortunately, though, this year he's only got 6.2 yards per target from that alignment, which is way below average. You see guys above 8 yards per target and guys even above 10 yards per target that are playing really well right now in terms of that statistic. So how does he get his work done? What routes? He gets it done two ways this year: inward breaking routes and fades. 52 of his targets, so about half of them, are either slants, curls, or digs. And all of those targets total to less than 400 yards. So mediocre. He's also got 23 fades or back shoulder throws, but those 23 attempts have resulted in just 111 yards, which is very inefficient. And then his other big route is the go route, and he's 0 for 9 on go routes this year. So when Dez was the guy that we remember, he had much more production on the fades, the goes, and the outs, and we're not seeing that production on his route tree anymore.
Well, he may have been the best red zone receiver in NFL history when it comes to abilities in the red zone compared to abilities on the rest of the field. I mean, I hate the fade, but the fade to Dez Bryant worked. My thing is, I'm kind of surprised that anybody is surprised, because we wrote about it a little bit in the book this year. If you go back to the last couple of years and you prorate Dez Bryant's performance over a full 16-game season, he just does not come close to the 1,300-yard seasons that he used to have. Right? 2015, obviously the quarterbacks were part of the problem.
And that was the injury year
Dez
also,
Bryant,
right?
Yeah, that was the year where he only played 9 games due to injury, and that
just so everybody's free.
The quarterback.
We've been staring at it. Maybe the audience hasn't. That was the year when he was injured, and that was the year where there was the big turning point statistically since then.
Right, but even if you double his yardage that year, right? Because he only played 9 games, and it's only 800 yards. And then last year, 13 games, 800 yards. So even if you make that a 16-game season with a good quarterback and everything that Dallas did last year, you're not quite getting to 1,000 yards. Dez Bryant has not been a 1,300-yard receiver now for a couple of years. He's had an injury addled. He's not as fast as he used to be. He's not as dominating as he used to be. This is not a surprise that there's some decline here. But he is definitely disappointing. DVOA, he is a 60th among 69 qualifying wide receivers, 53% catch rate. And his catch rates used to be around 65% every year. It was down to 43% in the year where it was Matt Castle. Okay, well, that's Matt Castle and Brandon Weeden. But he didn't bounce back to 65% after that. He was at 52 last year. He's at 53 this year. And that's with a pretty good quarterback. So I think, not only is Dez fallen off, I think Dez started falling off 2 years ago and nobody wanted to see it.
So I think you're right on. And I think you actually just mentioned where I was going with this breakdown of all his routes. So it's definitely a Dez problem to an extent. We haven't seen it in 3 years. The 2015 year, certainly injuries were a big part of it. He wasn't running well at all through a lot of that season while he was even on the field. And then the drops have also been a part of it. He's got 7 drops this year, which is tied for 7th in the league. Now, what I also think is a part of it when I look at the route breakdown is that this is a Dak Prescott issue, and that Dez Bryant is a very different receiver than he was with Tony Romo. And this goes back to a thought that we have, and it's a growing thought, I think, in a lot of analysts, that we don't want to look at receivers as just receivers. We should look at them as quarterback receiver batteries, right? So the Tony Romo to Dez battery looks a lot different than the Dak to Dez battery. Now, part of that is the speed, which I don't think we can overstate that he does look like a different player, but I also think it's about a skill set fit with the quarterback. Dak's top throws that he throws in terms of yards per attempt over the last 2 years are slants, posts, and screens. Easy throws over the middle of the field, not the type of throws that make the most use of a very talented outside receiver's skill sets. He isn't doing much down the field and outside the numbers with really any of their receivers. And I think a big part of Dez's struggles come back to not having a quarterback that fits that skill set. He's a throw me open outside receiver, relying on an accurate, strong arm passer, ball placement, like you were saying, that red zone ability. Dak is a lot of things, but I don't think that one of them is that quarterback and that skill set. And I think a little bit of what we've seen is that Dez just isn't as good a fit for the current offense the way it's being run with Dak Prescott, which is really interesting because we all think that Prescott's a good player. It makes, is it a trade possibility that comes up? But again, you go back to those other parts of his games and you say, he really doesn't look like he runs like the same guy, and what's going on with the drops. So I think we got a two-headed monster here.
The guy who fits better with Dak Prescott is Bryce Butler. There's been a couple years now where
When they use Bryce Butler does well.
For whatever reason, I think Bryce Butler's more of a speed guy, and
rather than a big physical guy.
And we're seeing that, and so we're seeing so the types of receivers and how they fit in with the quarterback. I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind, and interesting as we look around the league at different players. All right, Aaron, let's go ahead to the most important games of the week, shall we?
Most important game of the week is nothing even comes close. This week, now that we're getting into December, we have the most important game of the week by far, and the most important game of the year by far for making the playoffs, and the most important game of the year by far for Super Bowl positioning. So the most important game for the playoffs is Oakland at Kansas City. Nothing else this year has come close. Kansas City is in the playoffs 77% of the time if they win this game, 26.5% with a loss. Oakland, 38% with a win, 2% with a loss. This is a must-win game for Oakland and pretty close for Kansas City, which is why it's interesting that they were willing to suspend their best cornerback, Marcus Peters, for what he did last week with the throwing the flag in the stands and the coming out without his socks and all that, even though they need him in this game.
Very interesting matchup. It's hard to believe that these teams are still alive at this phase of the season, since we've seen them both go through their struggles. A couple of things about this matchup potentially favor the struggling Chiefs, actually. First of which is that they're playing at home, where they historically have a very good home field advantage. And also that they're number 11 in DVOA, where the Raiders are 21st, despite the same record. So,
yeah, and even if you look at the weighted DVOA, that lowers the importance of the early games when Kansas City was playing so well. They're still better 15th to 19th. They're close, but that home field advantage, again, there comes into play. I think home field advantage is significant. I'm not generally a believer in certain teams having larger home field advantages other than Seattle, or certain teams having smaller ones other than I would expect that the Chargers, we will learn, have a smaller one. But I will say that home field advantage does mean something in general, and it's good for Kansas City that the games against the Raiders and the Chargers, which are look, they're probably going to beat the Dolphins and the Broncos in the last 2 weeks, but they've got to win one of these next two, and they are at home at Arrowhead Stadium, and that is important.
So I'm interested that you were in New Orleans last week, where they have a pretty good home field advantage. Were you unimpressed? You think that theirs is basically statistically equal to all the others, with the exception of Seattle? Or do you?
Well, I can tell you that historically they are statistically equal, and I know it's a shock. Look, sometimes you learn things and they shock you. It shocks me. But over the last dozen years, Baltimore actually has the second strongest home field advantage. And if you look over a period of about 20 years, the only teams that really have a sort of a significantly higher home field advantage than average are the NFC West teams and Denver. And even there, the only one where it's a real difference is Seattle. And I'm not taking anything away from the fans. They were raucous. That was the loudest stadium I have ever been in. And I've never been to Seattle or Kansas City, so I do have to say that as a caveat. That was the loudest stadium I've ever been in. It was a rocking good time. I heartily recommend not only the city of New Orleans, but I recommend Saints games. I had a great time. But numbers-wise, shocking as it is, the Saints don't have actually a higher home field advantage than an average team does, and neither does Kansas City. But just the regular home field advantage is enough to give them an advantage in this game against Oakland.
Right. Maybe what's going on there is that every team, when they're good, they have a very good home field advantage.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest part of home field advantage is not the noise causing false starts. It's the subconscious change in the mind of officiating, where home teams get fewer penalties than road teams. And I think that is equal at pretty much every stadium. There's no doubt that Seattle does have something special going on with the false starts. They really do. They built that stadium to make noise. But overall, it's roughly the same for each team. Now, I mean, I think Kansas City has to figure out in this game why they've fallen apart over the last 7 weeks. Obviously, their defense is problematic, but the Raiders are the worst defense in the league by DVOA, so it's not like things are any better for them. Now, I think what's interesting is that the Raiders have been the worst team in the league, the worst defense against deep passes. So this may be a game where Kansas City wants to go back to the deep passing from early in the season. Lots like Tyreek Hill. Try to get past those Raiders cornerbacks before, despite the presence of Khalil Mack, there's almost no pressure coming from Oakland. They're near the bottom of the league in pressure rate.
Yes, absolutely. You mentioned it. Both these teams better at offense than defense. They both have had their coverage issues. So what I did, I went and took a look into how coverage schemes could play a role in the matchup. And big assist to our researcher, Dan DiGiuseppe, who put together some of this for me. So we all know that the Chiefs are such a man-heavy team. And with the suspension this week, that could have an interesting impact. When the Raiders have the ball, they have, even though the Chiefs have struggled in man some, Derek Carr, his passer rating is only 87 against man, which is number 22 in the NFL. So I wonder if the Chiefs maybe think that they want to get away from running so much of the man, or with Peters out, or if they think we want to stay with that because Derek Carr has seen his struggles there. Then on the other side of the ball, the Raiders like to really mix it up coverage-wise. As you said, they've given a lot up in terms of deep stuff, but in terms of man and zone, they've done both. They have the worst passer rating against, though, in the entire NFL when playing zone. Meanwhile, go across Alex Smith. He's the 6th highest rated passer against zone coverage in the league. So look for him if he sees zone this week to light it up against that Raiders defense. And maybe that's where some of those deep hits come in.
Yep, absolutely. I do think Kansas City, these losses they've had the last couple of weeks are all close. The implosion is not quite as bad as all the L's make it seem. I would not be surprised to see them turn things around and beat the Raiders in this game. And I do think that they need to win one of these two. But if Kansas City wins one of these two games, those last two are so easy that they look pretty good for winning the division.
Yeah, their last two games are the two teams that are lower than Cleveland and DVOA, right?
That is correct. The last two games are against the two worst teams in the league by DVOA. I can't believe that Denver is number 32 now. I never would have seen that coming. But Denver is number 32 now, and they're number 10 in defense. Everything we said about the Denver defense turned out to be true, except that their run defense got a lot better. Let's talk about the most important game for the Super Bowl. It is the 3rd annual DVOA Bowl, ta-da! Which is Philadelphia at the Rams. Philadelphia goes to the Super Bowl 24% with a win, 14% with a loss. The Rams go to the Super Bowl 13.5% of the time with a win, 7% of the time with a loss. What I'm looking at in this game is very heavily pressure from the Rams because while both teams are really good in pressure rate, the Rams offensive line is near the top of the league in preventing pressure. The Eagles offensive line, whether this is the offensive line or how Wentz plays, is near the bottom of the league in preventing pressure. And that is not a stat that you want when Aaron Donald is on the other side of the line.
No doubt about it. I'm fascinated by this game. This should be awesome. Both teams in the top 10 in all 3 phases of DVOA, and both quarterbacks playing really well. I tried to do a little bit of analysis, seeing what's different from them statistically in the way that they're playing. So they're similar numbers overall. Goff, more yards per attempt. He's been a little bit more aggressive. Wentz has thrown for more touchdowns, however. But diving a little bit deeper, Wentz does a little bit more of his work outside the numbers than Goff. So throwing to outside receivers, going outside the numbers. He's got 11.4 yards per attempt with 9 touchdowns, where Goff is averaging just 10.2. I said just 10.2 yards per attempt, but 0 touchdowns outside the numbers. Now, part of that is a reflection on the weapons that these two guys have, but part of it is also a stylistic difference between them, most certainly. But I think what that definitely shows you is why the Eagles were anxious to pay Alshon Jeffrey, a true bona fide outside receiver that can play out there.
I think another interesting thing about this game is the play action. Now, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the Rams in Minnesota. These were the top 2 teams in the league as far as frequency of play action. Philadelphia is 3rd in the league in frequency of play action. But this is shocking looking at the Sports Info Solutions charting numbers. The Eagles are actually a better passing offense when they don't use play action, which is very rare. 6.5 yards per play with play action. 7.2 yards per play without play action. The Rams defense is an average defense with play action. They're basically about where defenses are in general. They're 13th in the league with play action. They're 10th in the league without play action. So, an average split. Meanwhile, the Eagles defense is 3rd in the league against non-play action passes, but 18th in yards per pass against play action passes. So there could be an opportunity here for the Rams to get the big plays with play action while the Eagles have actually not gotten big plays with play action as much, even though they use it all the time.
Yeah, really fascinating there. Just a totally reverse split the way you'd expect to see it. Here's one that I'll throw at you before we sign off. In terms of the coverages, it's like we were breaking down with the other teams. The Rams, they prefer to play man, but they are very good at both man and zone. They're 6th in quarterback rating against in either scheme. Meanwhile, the Eagles play with much more balance, but they are much better in man than in zone. In man, they're allowing just 51% completions, 5.5 yards per attempt, and they have a whopping 11 interceptions. So take a look at the coverage matchups there as we're keeping an eye on annual DVOA Bowl number 3.
Yeah, it's interesting because Jim Schwartz's defense historically is rush 4, zone coverage behind. But I think they have moved to more blitzes and more man with the knowledge that his cornerbacks are better at playing man.
No doubt about it. And having certainly some talented linebackers that he can send helps out in mixing things up. All right, Aaron, it's been quite the morning here. We will sign off with a quick reminder that the charting data and projections are for sale. You can get your late season special package for just $10. You can get your projections that can help you through your fantasy playoffs. Subscribe to us, rate us wherever you find podcasts. Our MyBookie promo code, as a reminder, is off the charts. You get 50% of your deposit match. That's free money. And you can find us on Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS, at FB Outsiders. We will be discussing the front office turmoil in Cleveland all weekend long, you can bet. Have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next week.